This is the Connecticut River. It flows from the border of Canada down to the Long Island Sound, running 406 miles. This river fed the major settlements of Saybrook, Hartford, and Springfield, as well as the dozens of other settlements that occupied the valley, including Wethersfield and Northampton. This river served as the landscape for one of America's most influential thinkers, Jonathan Edwards.
Welcome to the first episode in our exploration of the life and thought of Jonathan Edwards. I'm Christian Cuthbert, Edwards scholar and pastor, and I'll be your tour guide to exploring Edwards. In this episode, we're going to travel along the Connecticut River, from Hartford to Northampton, exploring how the Edwards and Stoddard family came to the frontier. And we're going to begin this exploration right here at the Connecticut River Museum.
This museum doesn't speak to Edwards specifically, but it does give an idea of how the Connecticut River fed the life of the frontier in the 18th century. Edwards spent all of his youth, most of his life in fact, in the Connecticut River Valley. Many came to the valley to practice their Christian faith, while others found it a more suitable context to ply their trade. In Edwards family history, we find both examples.
Ola Winslow opened her wonderfully written biography of Edwards by stating that it would be easier to derive Edwards from his posterity than from his ancestors. Well, we're going to try and explore Edwards' ancestors anyways in order to understand the context into which he was born. And we're going to start with the Edwards side of the family.
Before the Edwards family set foot in the Connecticut River Valley, they lived in London during the time of Queen Elizabeth. Jonathan's great-great-great-grandfather Richard was ordained, but he was not given a parish. His great-great-great-grandmother Anna is said to have helped make a ruff for Queen Elizabeth herself. Richard supported his wife and son William by teaching in a small boys' school.
Ola Winslow writes, "As for Richard Edwards, schoolmaster, the story is almost a complete blank. There is no portrait, no scrap of handwriting, no personal tradition by which he may be brought to life after more than 300 years. So with Richard's untimely death in 1625, and Anna's remarriage to James Cole later that same year, our window into Richard Edwards, great-great-grandfather of Jonathan, closes. Now James Cole, along with his new wife Anna, her son William, and James's children, emigrated to Boston in 1633. A short time later, James and family moved out to Hartford with Thomas Hooker. And in Hartford, James Cole did pretty well, but his son William did not fare as well. William did not make freeman until age 40, and he was given very little responsibility in the Hartford community.
In order to help us understand Edwards' family better, we will visit Hartford's Ancient Burial Grounds. While there is no headstone for William here, both William Edwards and his stepfather James Cole are listed on the Founders Monument. This monument memorializes the group of people that came here with Thomas Hooker in 1636. While William died in relative obscurity, William's son Richard, the grandfather of Jonathan, became a central figure in Hartford, however, not always for good reasons. This is the grave of Richard Edwards. He seemed to be more central to the Hartford colony than his father William. There seems to be some debate as to what his profession was. Some sources suggest he was a coopersmith, while others suggest that he was an attorney. But we do know that he was made freeman at the age of 21 and given recognition. He was appointed chimney surveyor, town surveyor, constable, selectman, and representative.
But there was one episode that seems to dominate Richard's legacy. As the story goes, in 1690, Richard petitioned for divorce from his wife Elizabeth Tuttle. Now, Tuttle seems to have had some mental health issues, She was accused of being serially unfaithful, and Richard even challenged the paternity of their first child conceived out of wedlock. But then Jonathan's grandfather took the unprecedented step of petitioning for divorce twice before he had to convene a council who finally granted the divorce. Ola Winslow states in her biography, "Through this action, unique for its day, Richard Edwards stood alone against the law, the ministry, the social standards of his time, and by sheer persistence and the weight of his own adamantine convictions, forced an eventual victory."
I decided to explore the Connecticut State Library to find out more about Richard and Elizabeth Tuttle. Ava Chamberlain used the resources of the Connecticut State Library to research her book, The Notorious Elizabeth Tuttle. In her treatment, she challenges the traditional story which paints Richard as the upright victim of Elizabeth's mental health and serial unfaithfulness. Chamberlain recognizes that only Richard's side of the story survives, and she attempts to reconstruct Tuttle's side of the story by examining the sources around Tuttle, which include some fascinating episodes of murder and insanity. Chamberlain argues that Elizabeth's historic reputation is the product of gendered social expectations in 17th century America, which deprived us from hearing anything from Tuttle herself.
After a survey of the Edwards family, we find a surprising amount of instability. And that prompted George Marsden to write that Edwards is sometimes criticized for having too dim a view of human nature. But it may be helpful to be reminded that his grandmother was an incorrigible profligate, his great aunt committed infanticide, and his great uncle an axe murderer. Whatever social stigma may have been passed down to Jonathan by his father's family was more than offset by the reputation of his mother's family. Jonathan's mother, Esther, was raised right here in Northampton, the daughter of Solomon Stoddard. But her family roots go all the way back to London with Anthony Stoddard. Anthony Stoddard was a successful linen merchant who married Mary Downing of Downing Street fame, who happened to be the niece of Governor John Winthrop. They emigrated to Boston in 1639 after James Cole, William and Anna and family had already gone to Hartford, and Anthony was soon elected town constable. Now in that role, he was directed to arrest Francis Hutchinson, son of banished antinomian Anne Hutchinson. Ralph Kaufman wrote in his biography of Solomon Stoddard, "Certainly, Anthony Stoddard reasoned, heresy was more in the province of ecclesiastical censure than in the jurisdiction of civil law. The magistrates did not share Anthony's opinions because they saw Hutchinson's actions as a threat to the order of society. So they fined Stoddard 3 1/3 shillings for having challenged their authority." This independent streak was reflected in the life of his son Solomon. Now Solomon left for Harvard when he was not yet 15 years old, and he earned both his bachelor's and his master's degree there. He stayed on as the college librarian for a while before accompanying former Governor Searle as his personal chaplain in Barbados. Now in 1669, Solomon decided to go to London, but before he could leave, he accepted an invitation to preach in Northampton after the death of Reverend Wareham. In 1670, Solomon accepted a formal invitation to be Northampton's pastor. He married the widow Wareham, Esther, and he built his parsonage right here on this property on Round Hill in Northampton. Now the house we have behind us actually dates to 1744 and Solomon's son, Colonel John Stoddard.
Northampton today is a small yet bustling college town filled with boutique shops and family-owned restaurants. But the Northampton of Stoddard's day was very different. George Marsden writes, "In 1703, the little towns stretched out along the river were not peaceful New England villages of later postcards. Many of them looked like armed garrisons, especially from Northampton north to Deerfield, the region most vulnerable to Indian attacks."
Here we are at Bridge Street Cemetery, Northampton. Now Jonathan is not buried here. He's buried in Princeton, New Jersey. But Jonathan's grandfather, Solomon Stoddard, his uncle, Colonel John Stoddard, his daughter, Jerusha, and David Brainerd are buried here, along with a number of the Northampton congregation's members.
Solomon ruled Northampton theologically, introducing a novel solution to the halfway covenant problem. Solomon got rid of the relations of faith, where prospective members gave their testimony to be judged by the leaders of the church, whose approval allowed one to take communion. Instead, Solomon accepted all who made a profession of faith without examination, because he thought partaking in communion could be a means of grace that might help someone towards conversion. This idea was so novel, it became known as Stoddardianism.
Despite growing up within a day's ride of Hartford and his grandfather Richard, no one exerted more influence over Jonathan than maybe his maternal grandfather, Solomon Stoddard. After his years at Yale and his brief ministries in New York City, Bolton, and Glastonbury, Edwards moved to Northampton to assist his grandfather in August of 1726. He then took over for his grandfather in February 1729 after Solomon's death. But Solomon's influence extended far beyond Jonathan, far beyond even the Connecticut River Valley. In a sermon preached on the occasion of Solomon's death, Benjamin Coleman stated, "After those in his own neighborhood, it may be his name and ministry were not more dear and honored anywhere than in this great town, Boston, the place of his birth, where both ministers and people received his annual visits with a peculiar reverence and pleasure, bringing us the solemn counsels and warnings of God from year to year, which were received by us in crowded assemblies that hung on his lips as a people that sought righteousness and showed much love." The fact that people in cosmopolitan Boston would gather in crowded assemblies that hung on Solomon's lips, that showed reverence and pleasure, attests to the influence of Solomon Stoddard far beyond Northampton. And maybe no one in Jonathan's life exerted more influence over him, except for his father, Timothy, the subject of our next video. So thank you for joining us as we explore Edwards.